Good morning. I'm Alberto Ibargüen. I'm president of Knight Foundation. And on behalf of Lee Bollinger, Jamil Jaffer, and Emily Bell, it's my privilege and great pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural symposium of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. This is a particularly sweet moment for four of us who 7 years ago began a conversation that led to this morning. When Nick Lemon, Eric Newton, Lee Bollinger, and I began that discussion, which actually, Nick, you may remember, was at Vizcaya. He and I hang out at the Deering Estate all the time. It was not obvious to a lot of people that we needed a new champion to defend rights that most took for granted and didn't think were under attack. It wasn't that long ago, but they were simpler times. When we first talked, the First Amendment's application to individuals, the printed press, and broadcast media seemed settled. But at the dawn of the Internet of Things, the law of First Amendment was clearly not settled as to the new digital universe in which we would increasingly communicate everything. And it was not clear what framework might prevail, a free one like that for press or persons, or a licensed one like broadcast, regulated by government. Our bent was toward free, and we wondered who would make those arguments and who would pay for it. In 2010, it was also not clear to us what would be the effect on free expression of the worldwide nature of new media behemoths. What we knew or thought we knew as facts had suddenly started coming through algorithms alleged to be valueless and presented by companies with a transactional view of their relationship with multiple governments, clearly different from the independent and adversarial attitudes of traditional media. The First Amendment facilitates the search for truth and its dissemination, but the technologies meant to bring us closer together have instead driven us apart and engendered insularity. Common facts and studied truths are giving way to personal opinion and uninformed beliefs. And looking to future leaders, a Knight Foundation commissioned Gallup poll shows that among millennials in colleges and universities throughout the country, there's a growing tension between free expression and safe spaces. As I read that survey, a majority of students believe diversity and inclusion are values that should be protected, even at the cost of curtailing speech. That would make psychological harm of hate speech equivalent to the physical harm of yelling fire in a crowded theater. These are all questions for our time. Continuous technological innovation demands that the meaning of the First Amendment principles be reinterpreted and reinvigorated rather than merely preserved. We're aware, of course, that the First Amendment applies against government, but we're also concerned with what Floyd Abrams has called the spirit of the First Amendment, its anti-censorial soul. So as we talked back then, we developed our ideal, an independent organization well enough endowed that it would not be cowed by private interests and affiliated with a great university that could not be pushed around by government. It would engage society in a robust debate and establish itself as a prominent, permanent, and influential advocate of free expression in support of the world's gold standard for discourse in democracy. From our perspective at Knight Foundation, Columbia University, under the leadership of First Amendment scholar Lee Bollinger, and home to world-class law and journalism faculties, was the obvious partner. With Knight's original grant, Columbia's match, and subsequent support from Ford, Carnegie, Hewlett, and Open Society foundations, we've taken first steps. The Knight Institute's primary activities will be litigation, scholarship, publication, and conferences, all seeking to inform and engage our society in an ongoing discussion and understanding of First Amendment issues at the core of our democracy. We hope and trust Others of you will join from every point of view, united by that core value. Last year, Jamil Jaffer became the Knight Institute's founding executive director, and we could not be happier, even though he's standing right here, and he paid me to say that. He didn't. He brings a passion for free expression, an openness of mind, extraordinary intellect, informed by years of litigation experience in the national security area. And truly, if we had imagined him before we met him, we would have picked an executive director just about the way he is. So it's a great thing. Many people gave us sound advice, but I would single out and thank Floyd Abrams, Ted Olson, and Knight Foundation's chairman, John Palfrey, for their insight and counsel. And I want to recognize the founding board of the Knight First Amendment Institute, who are Eve Burton, Nick Lemon, Gillian Lester, Steve Cole, Jerry Rosberg, and Eduardo Peñalver. The very first person I spoke to about an idea for First Amendment Institute, who encouraged me and helped develop my thinking, was my son, Diego Ibargüen, who is the First Amendment counsel at Hearst, and I owe him that recognition and gratitude. Thanks to my colleagues at Knight Foundation, Jennifer Preston, our Vice President for Journalism, who has adopted this institute with the ferocity of a lifelong journalist, and Knight's former VP of Journalism and my advisor on this project, Eric Newton, who was there at the creation. And special thanks to Arya Nair, who will speak to us later today. His lifetime of leadership on free speech through words and principled deeds, and his unshakable commitment to liberty serve as an example to us all and a reminder of the courage and tenacity required to safeguard our constitutional rights. And finally, thanks from all of us to Kitty Ahmed and Columbia University's programs and event staff. This is a very happy day, and I'm only sorry that Lee Bollinger, our indispensable man, is unable to attend this inaugural event because of an illness in his family. Lee would have been an active participant in today's discussions about technology and democratic culture, journalism in crisis and transition, and about values the First Amendment is meant to serve. He would have noted that this is not the first time technology has changed society, that competing values have clashed or journalism been attacked. He might have pointed out that the Gallup survey I just cited also showed that an overwhelming majority of students support free speech, that the David Fahrenholtz of journalism are still at work and worthy of Pulitzers, that voices outside the political establishment, right and left, can still shape our national conversation and could be said to have more opportunity to speak now than ever before. And he might have even noted the truly wonderful fact that last Saturday night, a Muslim American of Indian descent, Hassan Minhaj, speaking at the White House Correspondents' Dinner and televised nationally, made fun of the media notables present and of the man he said runs our country, Vladimir Putin, and his friend Donald Trump. And the best part is that because of the First Amendment, he's not going to jail. Welcome to the Knight Institute, and now let me bring up our moderator for the day, who teaches at a law school up in New Haven, as I understand it, but his real reason for being here is that he's acting as the research director of the Knight Institute, Lincoln Kaplan. Lincoln?
So thank you, Alberto. I want to reinforce his welcome on behalf of the Knight Institute, but also on behalf of the Tao Center for Digital Journalism, which is our partner today in hosting this conference. Some of you may be movie buffs and you have an image in your mind of the person who says, lights, camera, action, to get a scene going. It turns out that nobody says that when you're making a movie. And instead, there's an assistant cameraman whose job is to take something called a clapperboard, and just before the beginning of each scene, to clap it together. The clapperboard has the number of what scene it is in the movie, and the clapping is meant to make sure that the sound and the video will be synchronized. So my role today is the assistant cameraman. I'll try to keep things synchronized. I will certainly pop up here from time to time, mostly preoccupied about the time and keeping things on track, but also occasionally having the pleasure of introducing our panelists. The first panel is called Free Speech in the Networked World. Our moderator, who's a visiting professor of law at Yale and a professor at the Tandon School of Engineering at NYU, and also the director of its governance lab, is Beth Simone Noveck, and I'm going to let Beth introduce the other panelists. So Beth and others, come on up.
So the congratulations and the celebration that we're here to mark this occasion of the launch. I'm going to speak softly and with a small stick. Of the Knight First Amendment Institute. I want to thank Alberto for his remarks and for his generosity together with his colleagues in making this happen, and to Jamil and to Link and to Kitty for bringing us here today. We're very excited to be here to kick off this event, and we have quite an auspicious panel together with my colleagues here, whom I will introduce. We are here to talk about the First Amendment and free speech and democratic implications of new technologies. So Knight, I had the great privilege yesterday of being in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Knight has also left its mark, having funded the Center for Civic Media there as well. And I was at a fabulous conference chaired by our friend Ethan that focused on the new technologies, in that case, of sensor networks, of the cheap and prevalent ability to measure air quality and water quality and radiation, and the connection of those sensors then to armies of thousands of individuals around the world who together are helping to monitor our governments, to keep our communities safer, and to keep our environment cleaner through the SafeCast and other citizen science programs. So there I was for this unbelievably hopeful event about the implications of new technology for democracy. And then I come home and I go to sleep, and I get up this morning, and there are 150 easily new emails in the last 6 hours, none of which are about anything civic or democratic. The first thing I did was get up to check them. I was the quintessential, as Tim would call it, homo distractus, or right, the female equivalent of homo distractus. And I'm checking my email for aluminum siding and pictures of cats, and at least I'm not tweeting sober at 3 a.m., but I am checking my email at 6 a.m. So the point is that there is this great disjunction. There is this great tension that we face between the potential that technology holds for our democratic and free speech future on the one hand, and something that I think is more akin to the democratic abyss. So we're here to talk about both of these poles. We're here to talk about the technologies and how they're impacting free speech. And we're going to divide our conversation into 3 parts. We're going to talk first about the impact on the individual. We're then going to talk about the impact on communities and groups and movements. And then we're going to talk about the implications for our institutions of democracy. And through them, I think we're going to weave, I hope, a robust conversation about both the technology, the history of how we got to this point, and then the implications for constitutional law and constitutional values. So with that said, let me turn the stage over to Tim. He needs no introduction here at Columbia, where he's a law professor, of course, and he is the author of several books, numerous articles, most recently The Attention Merchants. He is a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, also previously for the New Yorker and the New Republic, and he was just a few weeks ago, I believe, elected and named to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Congratulations. And to his right, Zeynep Tufekci, who is also an opinion writer for the New York Times and needs no introduction, who is coming to us from, as an associate professor from the University of North Carolina, I'm going to get the whole name right, School of Information and Library Science, and also a faculty associate at the Harvard Klein Berkman Center, also up in Cambridge. She is also the author of a book about to be released, May 16th, yes, I believe is the date, with Yale University Press, called Twitter and Tear Gas: The Power and Fragility of Networked Protest. And we are very excited to hear from both of them. We're going to try to make this as conversational as possible. I'm going to invite them to interrupt, to argue, to ask each other questions and alleviate my burden, and then, of course, to turn it over to you. So start thinking about what you would like to ask them about. So Tim, let me come back to this homo distractus problem. The tools of our tools, as Thoreau used to say, or we're becoming the products rather than, in fact, the customers.
Right.
What are the technologies that have gotten us to this point, and help us to understand what the implications are?
Sure, thank you. And let me also join everybody else in congratulating, well, I guess also the town center, but this is a big moment, and someone at Columbia Law School, I'm just happy to have the Knight Institute here. I just think it's very exciting, and thank you all for showing up here. I think this panel is about the sort of the cutting edges, the frontiers of technologies and speech, and I think we're in a really challenging time now, even to talk about it, in the sense that traditionally First Amendment concerns have been routed on a relatively straightforward framework, or at least it seems that way to us in retrospect. The pamphleteer who is trying to get their ideas out there and instead gets arrested by government. And so you have sort of a straightforward thing. The answer is to free that person from prison or allow them to publish their ideas. I think that the challenges that we're facing in the speech environment today are sort of different. You can put out your pamphlet. It's more the problem that no one will read it. You can have your ideas, and there can be a political discourse. It's more that we're all so overwhelmed, as you said, distracted, kind of lost. The question is whether our conversation, the kind of conversation we think about, has any meaning, any depth to it. There's always been, along with this question of free expression, a corresponding interest in freedom of thought. And one of the things that I believe is somewhat at risk in our current times is, at some level, our capacity for truly autonomous thought, when we're constantly trapped, when we get trapped sometimes in cocoons of technology where we are unable to even do what we want to do, if that makes sense. I know that sounds very complicated. And let me try and answer your questions. I think we are surrounded by technologies that view our attention, that time, that limited resource, as a valuable resource that they would like to harvest. A lot of this started in the media, but has really transferred to the technology industries. So much so that there's almost not a sector. I mean, this is a very rare thing where we're person to person, and very few of you are also on your computers, where we're very rarely in an environment where we are able to focus, where we are not also exposed to some other effort to take our attention for commercial purposes. And I think this is having an effect on, frankly, what we sometimes call our free will or our autonomy. And the technologies are obvious. They're, whether they're, because we see them all the time, from from email, through Twitter, through social media, through sites like BuzzFeed, which were designed from the outset just to extract attention for no other purpose whatsoever. So this is our environment, and I think as this institute is in the 21st century, not the 20th. These are the kind of challenges it'll have to grapple with. And we don't even have an easy way to talk about them as First Amendment challenges or freedom of expression challenges. But I think not to grapple them is to miss out on what is happening to our culture. So, my ideas.
So,
yeah.
I'll start with a little bit of framework, and then I won't be as long-winded in the rest of it. No, I won't be. You're fine.
I think she was referring to me, not to you.
No, not me. I'm going to be long-winded for 5 minutes, and then I won't be in the rest. Because I wanted to sort of put out what my concern is. As very kind introduction, thank you. I just came out with a book on network social movements. And in it, naturally, I deal with a lot of censorship issues because social movements face a lot of censorship. And very often in the technological realm, we think of censorship as anti-censorship, as circumvention. Government tries to block access to information X, people try to get around it, or they try to get information out. For example, in 2011, during the Tahrir Square protests, the initial ones in January, February, when President Mubarak very clumsily cut off the internet, the activists told me how they had smuggled cell phones in sat phones, where you can just connect to the internet without needing the national infrastructure. Within like 2 days, they had sat phones, and they had one ISP that was up that they found, and that was it. They could get out to the world, and if anything, the censorship backfired, because all the families who were using the internet to keep in touch with their kids in Tahrir Square were all of a sudden panicked because they couldn't get in touch with them, so they showed up. So this was 2011. And that is old-style censorship. My argument here is that we had moved in 2011 too, we just hadn't really formulated it. Exactly what you say, we've moved from censorship methods and a First Amendment understanding, I would argue, that was based on an information scarce world, where the point was, can you get your word out? Can you have your pamphlet be distributed? Absolutely to, can you get attention? Can you be heard? Can your credibility be established? Can the veracity of what you claim can be made with some level of confidence to people? So in the past, governments or censorship groups would try to break the link between the person and the information. Right now, the person and information is not really breakable. I watch anti-censorship people all around the world. When they want to circumvent, they circumvent. I mean, it's very rare that there is not a way to get around it. What is the break right now, as far as I can see, is the connection between getting the information and action, because the information is too much. The distractions, sometimes deliberately done by governments, are there to focus attention away. And if nothing else can be done, the veracity, this is incredible, this is a lie, this is fake news, all of that comes from governments too. So I call this like a positive censorship environment, where they're not going to block you, but they are going to disempower you through various architectures. The part that worries me, and this is why I'm the long-winded part here, is that I am pretty scared right now that the commercial infrastructure of the internet, which Tim's book is great about, is exactly geared by business model to this attention capturing, persuasion architecture, surveillance that's asymmetric, one-sided, that is very compatible with a 21st century form of authoritarianism that is going to surveil us and nudge us in ways that we don't really notice, and also is going to distract us in ways that are very hard to combat, and if nothing else, is going to question the credibility of things so much so that you don't know what's true anymore. You can't really figure out how to make sense of things, so you become disempowered. So what I see is that while we're focused a lot on 20th century, 19th century forms of censorship, there's this very insidious new form of control that has grown very widely. And I talk a lot to technology community, and I keep telling them, look, when I talk to activists, they're not asking me how to circumvent. All of you here are designing tools for circumventing censorship. When I talk to activists, you know what the question I get asked is? If I take a picture and I post it, is there a way for me to assert, I took this picture at this time, at this place, and it's me? They're actually trying to assert authenticity. They're not trying to circumvent as much. Why? Because this is what happens. I'm from Turkey, which is why I feel like that person who watched a movie, horror movie, and wants to yell, do not go into the basement. I know what happens. And then what happens is, right now in Turkey, for example, in the Kurdish southeast regions, the internet is not cut off. The conflict that has Turkey's long, multi-decade, maybe centuries-long conflict, it's still there. it has sparked again. Spike in deaths, spike in the whole thing. The internet is there. I know the region. I have friends on the ground there. People I know. I can follow things. I can no longer make sense of what's going on. I feel like I was in the old censorship regime when I lived in Turkey in the 90s and there was a single television channel and I just had no information. Right now I have a flood of information. But here's what happens. Somebody posts a picture and says this happened. 30 people come and say it's from Gaza. It's old. Sometimes it is. People come and lie on purpose. Maybe sometimes they're volunteers. People come and when something there happens, we have seen this in China done deliberately, where the so-called 50-cent army doesn't go and argue with anti-government people. When there's an anniversary, they go over there and distract people. They're, as your book sort of points out, they're going for the attention part. So right now, when I look at social media, I have all this source of information from a part of the world I'm deeply familiar with. I am motivated to try to figure out, but the information environment is such that I cannot figure it out, and there's 50 other things going on, and then there's the distraction thing. So, and that's where we are. So that's kind of the worry I have, is that we're arguing old-style censorship. We're arguing old-style political mobilization when there's a new insidious regime. And I have to say the Facebooks, Googles, and everybody else in the world is very compatible with this because that's also their business model.
So Tim, help us to unpack this a little bit. So it was, in 1971, Herbert said, "A wealth of information creates a poverty of attention."
Right.
And we're all, so we've seen this for a while. You've written about early propaganda and early advertising. Mm-hmm. How is this different? Why is this at this scale that Zeynep is describing? What can you unpack this for us?
Sure. No, I think that's helpful. So maybe it would be useful to talk about this administration, which is, and this American administration, sorry, which I think is, let's just say, not devoted to the ideals of the First Amendment, in my opinion. And and see how. The press
is writing furiously.
So if you look at old-fashioned propaganda and totalitarian states and control, and something I've spent a lot of time thinking about, the idea was, almost straightforward, which is you just block out competing channels. You make one story heard, and it's easy. So it's like the Soviet Union or so on, Maoist China. And you make sure the same message gets delivered over and over and over again until people begin to believe that's the truth. So I'm not going to say that the current administration is anyway as successful as some of the other information totalitarian states. But they do have a strategy, and it's almost fascinating to realize how it works. It starts with the realization there's a limited amount of time and attention anyone has to think about things. And then you create a spectacle so absorbing, so totalizing. There's no censorship, but you have this constant domination of headlines. I don't know how often I've gone to any newspaper site, and the most emailed stories, it's surprising when there's one that does not have the word Trump in it. So you have a complete, now a lot of the attention is critical, but the question is, where is all the attention? And so I think what the Trump administration, and Trump himself understands, is there's always two contests going on. There's contests on the merits, which is, who's right about this issue, is this wrong or right? But then there's the underlying contest to attention for who is being listened to. And we don't have a state media, we don't have a single channel, but we do have a media that is always has been, but is particularly desperate for ratings. And by that mechanism, it's possible to convert what is a private media environment into a private channel, much of it critical, nonetheless, all of it on the president and what his ideas are. Mm-hmm. And this is something I noticed. So I worked, as did you very briefly, in the White House. And the contrast with the Obama presidency is interesting. Obama was the president, obviously, but he was not well suited to this environment, I think. He could give a big televised speech and people would pay attention, but, and maybe for good, but more or less, I think he was kind of not in people's day-to-day attentional lives. He kind of showed up now and then. There'd be weeks he'd be kind of missing unless you were really devoted to watching what he was doing. The media wasn't, he often just sort of gave appropriate speeches on important topics, kind of boring. You know, he didn't throw out insults. And so therefore, he didn't actually have this grip on the American public. You know, I mean, he was still the president, but he didn't have this sort of attentional grip. His ideas often were not well understood. They were kind of too complicated also for the general public. He didn't succeed. And in contrast, the current president has, you know, a couple slogans that just get in people's heads over and over and over again. In order to keep that going, he does have to have this crazy spectacle. But you'll notice, anytime there's a threat of the presidency leaving the news, something is done to keep it back. And I think that is how control works in our times. It starts with just, as I've said, domination of attention, making sure you are always a story, your story is a story. And what that does is allows you to really get access to people's minds and really get your messages through, so that ultimately everything is either a reflection or a reaction to you. And that's what I would call power.
Tim, do you think there are specific technologies that are, if we want to use it to blame here, that are worse offenders? Zeynep just mentioned Google and Facebook. You talk a lot about also to Google and Facebook. Twitter is obviously very prevalent here. Can we actually talk about the material reality here of what is causing this?
I would talk about the business models rather than the technologies themselves. So, you know, people used to in the old days complain about how the war, you know, for ratings had kind of denigrated television and so forth. I would say the race for clicks makes television look dignified by comparison. You know, the rule of the almighty click has been the worst thing that has happened to the web. The web was this incredible, idealistic technology, you know, founded on some great ideas, but not enough was done to keep it essentially away from being dominated by that need to be completely absorbed with clicks. So I don't think it's the particular technologies. I mean, maybe they have lent themselves only to having a business model that relies on clicks, and that's maybe part of the problem. If somehow someone had figured out micropayments at some point, so easy, you know, way to pay a penny for things, then it wouldn't quite have this sort of desperate nature. But, you know, as I brought up BuzzFeed earlier, an example. I mean, you know, BuzzFeed is what it is, but it had dragged, I mean, as someone who spent time in journalism as well, it sort of dragged everyone along in its wake. When you're competing with cats and you know, human tricks and so forth, it leads everyone down that same path. And I think that has been, the business models more than the technologies have been the problem.
I'm going to completely agree, and I can talk about how the technologies grow from the business model. It is absolutely, like, I don't think we can talk about this without the business model. The business model is capture your attention, sell it to advertisers. That's basically and that's where everything comes from. And so when you have a business model like this, and let me give you an example of how it happens, and then I can walk back what the technology involved is and why I think it's dangerous. Let's go to YouTube. Go watch something on vegetarianism, and you will immediately be suggested, veganism. You want to watch about veganism? Is it hardcore enough for you? Go watch Trump rallies. You will be suggested white supremacist leaning stuff. Go watch a Democrat or left-leaning kind of video. You get suggested conspiracy left, more edgy left. Whatever it is you watch, you get edgier stuff. This is also true that I've observed on Facebook, is that the things that get a lot of attention by its architecture are either things that are kind of outrageous and get you angry, or things that are really sweet and lovable and cuddleable. And both of them, and I'm fine with, you know, cuddleable, lovable cats, but the thing is, that is playing on a very normal human psychological architecture. If I see a crowd, this is, you know, experimentally, the angry part is the first thing that's going to jump at you because that denotes a threat. We have special, like that outrage thing, there's a reason we pay attention to it. If you live in a hunter-gatherer little group, you do want to know who's angry at you because that's a potential threat. Also, we are, of course, you know, child-raising creatures by biology in general, so we're kind of like the cute, cuddly things, fine. What's happening is that these businesses are surveilling you. Thousands, millions of data points on all of us. And they have these machine learning algorithms that they don't even understand anymore, that are very good at figuring out without the programmer knowing, they're not programming this, right? The machine learning is kind of looking at all the data it has on you. And my argument is that without even, I don't think Google is doing this on purpose. I think it's machine learning algorithm, which, as I said, it's a new kind of programming. Well, it's not, it's just something that the programmer doesn't understand what it's doing. Seems to have cracked the human code that the edgier things make you go down that attention rabbit hole. Have you ever done it with Wikipedia? You're looking something mainstream and then half an hour later you're reading the tongues of frogs and how they work, and then you're just down this rabbit hole. It's very engrossing. I think YouTube's algorithms have figured that Wikidrift thing, and whatever you see, they keep wanting to pull you down that rabbit hole that is at the edges, or something that we all kind of watch as a spectacle. And they do this by using the surveillance they have on you to nudge you to this attention capturing thing. And since that's the business model now, also for newspapers, 90% of new ad money is going to them. This is Google, this is Facebook, this is all of them. This is creating an environment in which that's how you get attention, by pulling to the edges. And worse, by their experiments and by what we know about how it works, you can test this dynamically and use social science kind of understanding to once again figure out how would I push this person's button, and just you, not everybody. This is the part I think is very insidious. In the old times in TV, if you saw an ad, everybody saw it. Now in the 2016 election, this is something I had proposed might happen in 2012, and people laughed that it wouldn't happen, but apparently Trump people claim they did this. They used Facebook profiling. They at least tried. We don't know if they managed, but they say they did. They used Facebook profiling to identify people who were vulnerable to being demobilized, not persuaded, demobilized. Black men in Philadelphia. I have independent confirmation black men in Philadelphia were actually targeted this way. I don't know the extent because Facebook won't tell us the data. To demobilize them from potentially voting for Hillary Clinton. Haitians in Florida using the Clinton fund stuff. Now, because this was done using profiling you with Facebook, and Facebook data can profile, for example, your psychology. It knows if you're an extrovert, it knows if you're feeling depressed, it knows your politics. These are very easy things to figure out from the amount of surveillance you have. And since the ad goes to you and only to you, there is no public TV ad that the counter campaign can go and say, wait, this is false, or here's a counter argument. So privately, we might have had a situation in which an election that was decided by a couple 100,000 people, 100,000 people, I'm sorry, there might have been a key role play by these dark ads that none of you saw, except the people being targeted, very nicely targeted to their vulnerabilities, not to persuade, but to keep from action, saying who knows what, because this is also private. So our public sphere, not only is it now an attention capturing system that works to push us to edges, but it is also something that we're deeply surveilled, and plus it's private. There's two companies and they know what's going on. We don't even know what's going on. And right now, even though a lot of Silicon Valley is very liberal, it's either progressive or libertarian or liberal, I keep arguing the craft of what you're doing is very compatible with the 21st century authoritarianism. And sooner or later, it's going to catch up. It's not going to be like, oh, this is what we mean to do. Because as we know from history, the makers and the craft of tools don't really determine how exactly they're going to be played out. And I think we're here. That it's like every week I look at tech papers, and the amount of stuff that can individually be figured out about every one of us at very deep level. It is not demographics anymore. It is not white woman with PhD. It is an extrovert with this is the and right now is feeling kind of a little worried. Like that specificity is absolute. This isn't science fiction anymore, and it's all in the hands of a few companies.
So let me ask, you sound a lot worried to me. Are you, Tim, are you a lot worried, or is this just shy of the creepy line? Is this the tracking of the guy who searches for pancreatic cancer and then gets the funeral ads creepy that you describe, or is it the abyss? And then I want to talk to you about what we're going to do about this.
The abyss, I think, is...
the totalitarian
I don't think
abyss.
none of this leads to an abyss. I just think it leads to the sacrifice of something very important, which is the danger of living a life that is less yours than you really might think.
Very good way
You know,
to put it.
or to be almost subject to constant manipulation, and in a subtle form where you're not fully aware of it. So it doesn't lead to abyss. It's not like anyone's going to starve. It's just that it's hard to get away from, to get yourself unstuck and to think thoughts that are yours. That's why I wanted to, a theoretical level, speak about how the concerns we're talking about, which are not the First Amendment's traditional concerns, are nonetheless the same thing the First Amendment is aiming at. I was reading, this is going to sound pretentious, but I was reading Seneca over the weekend, along with Vince Blasey's, and Seneca was writing...
In the original or in English?
In English.
Then it's not pretentious.
Yeah.
Then it's okay.
And he was writing about freedom, and what freedom, sort of Stoic philosopher, and he's like, well, you have to focus on the things which there's certain things you don't have control on, mainly the external world, but what you do, of course, have control on is the internal world, your thoughts and your opinions. And I was like, I don't think, it seems like we're in the opposite situation. We have a lot of freedom over our external world, but our internal world is maybe the one where we are much less free than we'd think. I mean, I'll just give you an example. How many people here have ever sort of gone to your computer with the idea you're going to write one email, or maybe you're going to buy a plane ticket, and then suddenly 3 or 4 hours are gone, and you have no idea. It's almost like you've gone into the the attentional casino or something. You're sort of like, oh, I'm just going to place one bet, and or I just want to do this one thing, and then it's lost. And that happens.
It's built that way.
Of course, it's built that way. It's built like a casino, and I think this happens to us all the time. Such a sense of that internal freedom, which Seneca assumed. So, of course, you have the internal freedom. It's more the external freedom that is challenging, because I guess, at the time, you couldn't always go where you wanted. We have that opposite problem, and I guess that's what I'm concerned about, this sort of protection of internal freedom. I also bring this up in the context, I was reading Vince Blasey's here, and I was reading one of his great essays about homes, and our focus on the competition of ideas, or the metaphor of the marketplace of ideas. And I think that, one of the challenges for the Knight Institute will be some of the things that Vince talked about in that article, is moving beyond some of and it's something you've been saying, I guess some of the 20th century conceptions of what free speech is about, the battle against, it's kind of straightforward censorship. So that the marketplace of ideas is sort of opened up, and there's an open competition for ideas, into some of the more subtle ideas of what a well-functioning society with free expression looks like. I realize that didn't fully answer the question.
But I'm going to push you. I want to. Before we move on to talking about groups and social movements, I want to stay on this question of what we can do to repair our life. And it's funny, as you're talking, I took the train, the increasingly slow Amtrak train, from Boston to New York yesterday, and my child was sitting next to me. He spent 4 hours straight on Wikipedia, going down that rabbit hole. I'm going to ask him about the tongues of frogs when I get home to see if that was, and the range of topics. So some part of me thought, oh, this is wonderful serendipity in learning.
When it's Wikipedia.
We both like Wikipedia.
I think it's great when it's Wikipedia.
When it's Wikipedia. But the question is, what are the things that we can do, both from an individual social behavioral level, in terms of turning off our devices, to legal remedies from a doctrinal perspective? What can we do as individuals or as institutions? What are some of the solutions that we might think about?
Do you want to go first? Or?
Well, I mean, the Wikipedia is a great example. When you go down the Wikipedia rabbit hole, you're in control. I think I love going down those. As a kid who grew up under censorship and not speaking English, I read every encyclopedia I had in Turkish, because that's all I had. Back to forth, I ran out. I'd be like, I read the P's again today, So for me, this information-rich environment is amazing. And Wikipedia is not trying to manipulate my attention. It's kind of like I am in control, and I do this, and I really enjoy that. When you go on social media whose business model is to capture your attention, they are using the data on you. It's not even a random thing. Using very deep data they have on you, and without telling you that's what they're doing, they're manipulating you very purposefully. This is exactly like their engagement is this. How do I keep this person on site a little longer? It is literally the same architecture as the intermittent rewards in casino. If you lose too much in a casino, you'll get upset. So the things are very nicely engineered to, and Tim's book is great on all of these sort of these mechanisms that work now for attention, to give you some rewards here and there. I mean, you're absolutely going to lose. They're just going to keep you there and lose you to the maximum. This is how our current, it's not just Facebook, it's not just Google, it's the newspapers. If you publish a op-ed that gathers a lot of hate linking and negative attention, you still get the clicks. As long as you're in the ad business model, it works for you to publish a poorly argued, outrageous, straw person op-ed. Great for your business. This is bad for our democracy. This is bad for free speech because we're spending our time in outrage and hate linking and arguing why something's stupid when you should be also, which is okay to a degree, I guess, to point out what's not smart. So to control our attention back, we would need to interrogate, I think, business model. It goes absolutely bad. As long as you have a business model that's based on capturing your attention, it is going to be disruptive to democracy. It's going to be damaging to free speech because you'll be able to speak, but if you're not doing these sort of shady things, you're not going to get the attention. And I think of First Amendment in the same way. I don't think it's the right to speak into the mirror or to space. It is a marketplace of ideas that functions in some healthy way. Yes, it may never have existed perfectly, some kind of Habermasian ideal where you have some discursive space that is public. Instead, we have a discursive space that is private, that is manipulated, that is where not only are ideas not discussed in some ideal form as ideas, they're completely linked to who you are because there's a thing tracking who you are, trying to nudge you in all sorts of ways. So as an individual, I can do a bunch of things, put your phone away, there's a lot of sort of practical things you can do, but I don't think any of them would work at the society level because it's kind of like food. We're evolved to eat sugar and salt for a reason. We evolved under food scarcity, and now that you have food abundance, you have to figure out how do you change the ecology. And that's kind of like, I can do things individually, but I keep finding myself hitting walls of the business model that encompasses me.
So the organic kale of the internet we need to find. Are there legal solutions? In Europe, it is not a contravention of free speech. In fact, it's a promotion of free speech to say we will have no ads during soccer matches.
Right.
That is considered a promotion of democratic values, ads for the halftime.
Right.
Are there things we can envision that we might, under our 20th century concepts, not today don't seem possible, but tomorrow might become necessary?
I'm going to give an answer, unfortunately, is going to be about the challenges faced by the Knight Institute rather than the easy solutions.
Well, that's another way.
Because
what's their work?
What their work is, because I think that they, and this goes back to, again, Vince Blasi's idea of sort of the uncovered angles of the First Amendment, or of freedom of expression. Let me talk a little bit about the journalistic challenges before the legal challenges. So journalism always has this challenge, which is, if you lay down your own, sort of the arms race problem, which is that if you decide you're going to, be very responsible, you're not going to publish stuff that's outrageous or gets people interested, the result in our environment is you get ignored and forgotten, and you also lose money. And so, it's kind of this, very challenging situation where the answer of being sort of more reasonable, pulling out of the fight leads to your own ideas getting lost. And so everyone feels they sort of have to engage. I was thinking about, this is a constant challenge when you think about the Trump administration in particular. So you have you have a White House which has government who's made its project the constant domination of attention, winning the intentional battle every day, right? And if things get quiet, they win again. So what do you do about that? Well, one thing you could say, well, maybe we should just completely ignore this. If this is a source of power, if this is how administration is reaching people, maybe you ignore them. But if you ignore them, other outlets will cover them, and then obviously there's things happening that need to be criticized, right? And some opposition groups and journalists are having the time of their lives. I mean, frankly, journalism is, in some ways, financially, is being saved. But so that is the real challenge. But then you're also contributing to the problem. I'm saying of becoming a private channel for the president, and everything else getting blotted out. Even issues that might be really important get blotted out because all you need to do is have one tweet about North Korea, which no one can not cover that.
It isn't
how can you not cover nuclear war, right? But then on the other hand, could, or some things are just about nothing. Like the wiretapping story, the stories about the supposed wiretapping of the Trump Tower took up hours and so much, based on absolutely zero. There was never a single, there was maybe some rumor, but there was nothing. But it devoured, so much public attention and time. No one could resist that story. And, that keeps happening over and over again. So I don't know what journalists are supposed to do, but it's challenging. So in terms of the law and the First Amendment, as I said, this is a challenge because what do you do about government control of information programs that don't rely on straightforward censorship, cognizable with a cause of action? That is, I think, the Knight Institute's question. A type of censorship, neo-censorship, which is what you were talking about, which is discrediting, the strategies of distracting, discrediting, overwhelming, outdrowning. None of those are actionable in a traditional First Amendment sense, but they can have the exact same effect of just straight up censorship, which is leave people really only believing one set of options and not hearing the others. The ultimate effect is the same. The methods are completely different, and they're not easily actionable. So, I don't have the lawsuit that solves the day here unless, but maybe someone here does.
We'll leave that to
Right.
Jamil, and let me shift the conversation a little bit now from the individual lens to the group and to what this means. You've given us, Zeynep, already some picture of what it means to protest and be a social activist in this drowning sea of information. Do you see technology and its impact on our right of association, our freedom of protest, as being a net positive or a negative?
Yes. So I have a whole book on how social movements are empowered and disempowered, right? It's the strength and fragility for a reason, because I couldn't come up with one or the other. It's both at the same time. So on the one hand, obviously, there's a great empowerment and freedom of assembly. Right? A social movement operates by finding like-minded people, coalescing, creating this sort of internal cohesion, and then going from there. So this is going to be an octopus part. On the one hand, this is true. On the other hand, this works for Egyptian dissidents. It works for neo-Nazis. Right? They are also a social movement. So internet's not your pony, right? If it has a homophily producing social movement sparking thing, it works for multiple social movements, and not all of them are good. This is why slogans like Facebook's open and connected as mission just creep me out, because without a normative ethical framework, that is not a good slogan. Like connecting neo-Nazis, I don't think is a good thing. And I can say this while also being really aware that you can respect the freedom of speech, while at the same time recognizing not all viewpoints are a positive contribution, because, and this is where the because is, that freedom of assembly is increasingly under threat from organized groups using social media affordances to disrupt the freedom of assembly of others. This is what I've been arguing. Like, if you sort of see the Twitter problem with abuse, Twitter is a very freedom of speech friendly environment. It is slow to censor, if at all. You have to drag it to court. It'll fight you. In Turkey, it drags its feet, so it's still open and it's fairly effective in a lot of anti-censorship. So this is like, on the one hand, I'm like, great. On the other hand, what has emerged, I think on fourth hand, is that groups that want to shut down others, neo-Nazis, they organize to use these freedom of speech tools to disrupt the freedom of assembly of others, right? So when you want to get together and talk like 7 people, 10 people, this room, imagine a technological affordance that lets anybody in the world come in and bug our conversation. Like by bug, I don't mean listen, I mean disrupt it. People raising their hands, somebody getting up, somebody jumping up and down, somebody calling me names. Well, so freedom of speech and freedom of assembly at the technological scale we have can have this tension that other people's freedom of speech, if they're allowed to sort of disrupt you, takes away your freedom of assembly. So that is what I'm seeing with a lot of social movements around the world, is that it's either professional trolling, by which I mean government. Sometimes it's ideologically motivated, neo-Nazis going after black people on Twitter, very common. They do this on purpose. They go after Jewish people on Twitter so that you give up. Like you're not censored by a government, but you have 1,000 people who are constantly bugging you, and you don't have kind of the tools to protect your freedom of assembly. So you voluntarily withdraw from the public sphere as it exists. So this is, we have, I love Orwell like 99% of the time. I just think he was a great thinker of ecology of technology. Some of his essays, like the one on nuclear weapons, is amazing. I wish 1984 was not read as widely. I think it distracts us from the current model. Everybody thinks surveillance, they connect it to 1984. Well, that's the Soviet Union model, that's the totalitarian model, that's not our threat. I'm like, Huxley, let's read Huxley if we want to go classical. What I see is censorship not through the sort of, we're going to surveil what you said and just sort of drag you middle of the night, but we're going to organize, either voluntary, as I said, ideological, or paid in Russia, China, other countries. They're going to disrupt your freedom of assembly. They're going to wear you down, especially if you're a minority person. They are going to harass and scare, and you have a right to be scared because, who the heck are these people? So that what I see is this insidious self-censorship from the technological environment. And that's the thing, like, yes, you can speak and nobody's censoring you, but you are just not doing it because of the environment that it does. And that's what I see with social movements is they first find it very empowering, and then governments get their act together. Last example, in China, the 50 Cent Army I was referring to earlier, China apparently has this really large, couple 100,000 people army of trolls, as they're called. They're not cute trolls, they're like government employees. And over at Gary King and Jennifer Pan, when Jennifer was at Harvard, they did this great study of what do these people do, right? We didn't really know. And it turns out when you're posting something anti-government, they don't come and argue with you. And when you post something anti-government, the government doesn't come and censor you. They actually want to know, like they're kind of keeping tabs on you. What they do is if you're posting anti-government stuff, as long as there's no collective action, you're allowed. But if it gets loud enough, the 50 Cent Army organizes on purpose to create a distraction over here, right? You're here like, oh, it's Tiananmen anniversary, and there they have a completely manufactured name your price, Taiwan crisis. Some actress is having an affair. It doesn't matter. China is one of the most advanced things understanding attention. They censor by drowning your ability to assemble freely by creating all these things, and then they go and create little fights and all these things. And we know they're government employees. The study is ingenious. You can just look it up, Gary King and Jennifer Pan, because they work, the 9 to 5, and we know a lot of things about it right now. So I think that's where we're going around the world. In some places it's the government, and places like the United States, it's not the government yet, but it's a movement. I mean, on social media, I follow Trump's social media for a year and a half now. I followed it every year. When it started, I was like, this feels familiar. I said I'm from Turkey, right? I was like, this is viable when people were laughing at it. It's very much like that. They go and they say, we are going to create this, and they do it.
Does this push more people then into the streets and offline, or what's, maybe Tim, you want to weigh in here on what you see as the implications for groups and social movements and collective action?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not a very upbeat panel, is it? I feel like.
Don't worry, I'll turn it around at the end, I promise.
That's fine. It's not supposed to be a good time.
Link has a card which is 10 minutes till optimism that it's going to put up.
No, I was just thinking about how dark. I am concerned about I realize I don't have that much to say about groups since I don't necessarily study them. Although I'm concerned somewhat about the substitution effect. I don't think people are in the streets that often. I think that we have such substitutes for socialization.
Right.
I mean, this is kind of a rare occasion. Here we are in person and so forth. We've never actually met in person, although we know each other. And I've been thinking lately about our existence, my existence, the sense that you know people when you know them on Facebook or on social media, the kind of the conversations that you have on Twitter, are they really conversations or a set of sort of declarations that kind of go back and forth? And I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm interested in this sort of substitution effect of virtual assembly versus real assembly. And I don't know what to say about it, but I think that maybe sometimes in-person assembly gets competed out, and that might be a challenge.
I'm going to sort of say one thing is that I don't think there's any magic to streets, to be honest. I mean, if you have what is the point of a street protest, right? I mean, the way I conceptualize this is that the street protest, I marched in the anti-war march in 2003, right before the Iraq War, and I looked at, there's a sea of faces, a million people in New York. I thought, surely they can't ignore it. And George W. Bush was like, why should I pay attention to this focus group? And I was offended. I was like, there's a million of us. Why? He was right. He was right in the sense that a street movement, I think, is effective to the degree that it can gather attention, that it can signal some underlying capacity. And at the moment, and this is a core thesis of my book, because we're using digital tags, technology hashtags to scale up very quickly, I think what happens to a lot of social movements is that Women's March, a couple of Facebook posts, millions of people in the street. Sounds great, feels great. I marched my whole life, I'm a movement person my whole life. It feels great, but at the moment, I know that it doesn't signal the same capacity, say the March on Washington did, and not because one is better than the other, but it's because in the past, to organize the March on Washington, you had to have a 10-year movement to get there. Right now, you can do a hashtag and scale up. It's kind of like the startup just scales up. Instagram was bought for $1 billion with 11 employees. Technology allows you to scale up very fast and go to the streets very fast. Except when you are a social movement, you're not going to have Facebook show up with $1 billion. You're going to have a government coming at you. So you've gone to this millions of people thing very fast, and you're thinking, we're really powerful. I'm thinking you're actually not signaling an underlying capacity, because it's almost like, you're climbing Mount Everest, but somebody helicoptered you. The hashtag.
What does it mean to signal an underlying capacity?
So what I mean is when you're in 1963 or 5, and you see a big march on Washington, and they organized it against all odds, and they pulled it off. It was a very difficult thing to pull off. You're thinking, if they can do this, they can do 10 other things, right? You're signaling. It's kind of like if you're climbing Mount Everest without aids and you're really good mountaineer. So you're signaling you can also climb another mountain. Whereas if you use digital tech to scale up very fast, and I'm a government, I look at it, Hong Kong. The Hong Kong movement, the umbrella movement came out. It, again, used tech to sort of scale up Occupy. Used technology. In 2 weeks, it organized global marches, 80 cities. But it was using this digital technology to scale up so fast, there actually wasn't any other threat implied and signaled, because you just used the hashtag and Facebook. And governments, at first, the Arab Spring, they were like, oh, scared? Maybe it's the path. But they've learned. They look at it and they say, you know what? You guys just use the hashtag to come here. You do not signal any other threat to my power, through electoral, institutional, other forms of thing. So I think, if anything, I'm not against protest movements per se, but in the past, protest movements were a culmination of movement building. At the moment, they're the initiation of movement building, and they feel powerful even though they're not at that time. They've been helicoptered there, and that sense of false power, I think, trips them up.
Do you think that there is some possibility in older social movements that they represented the potential for violent overthrow of the government? Is that what you're sort of saying?
Not
when
necessarily,
you say capacity,
the
Bolsheviks started on the streets, for example. And
they did, but they faced a very weak state. What they did was, like, when you look at, say, when you think of social movements, what can they do? They can disrupt things. I don't think a modern social movement is going to violently overthrow a state, because states are too powerful at the moment. But they can be really disruptive. Or look at the Tea Party. It represented a genuine electoral threat, and arguably is the most successful social movement in 20th century in the United States. It was, and it started... 21st, I'm sorry. It started with a protest, but it then turned into developing that capacity. It was aided by some right-wing groups. It developed capacity. So it developed both disruptive and electoral capacities, and it was able to sort of create its thing. Whereas if you just go to the streets, again, no problem going to the streets. That's not the issue. You're not there as a result of a bunch of other things you did. And if you're a lawmaker, you're thinking, are they going to disrupt? Are they going to block streets? Are they going to primary me? Are they going to X, Y, Z, right? All the things that social movements...
Right.
So let me just, for a timekeeping matter, I just want to say that in a moment we're going to go to Q&A. Do people just get up, or do we have roving mics or something I need to know about that people have to wait for? There is a roving mic. Right. There it is. Okay, so I will ask for hands in just a moment, but let me shift both of you lest I not fulfill the promise of asking you something to reflect on the optimism here before we shift over. So what I'm hearing, though, and what this is suggesting is that, in fact, the way to move from activism to action is actually very traditional strategies like legislative influence, like what we might think of as lobbying, so affecting traditional institutional channels. Are there other things for both of you, just very quickly, so we can open it up?
Sure.
Give us some positive thoughts about the institutional implications, how we actually shift some of this into more promise for free speech, how we cultivate some of that positive agenda that perhaps the Institute should work on.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to go back to the sort of freedom of conscience, freedom of thought stuff. One thing I think is heartening, in my book, The Attention Merchants, I do suggest that there are, there's kind of these reactions or mass reactions to over stimuli by advertising or other things like that. And people either get bored, they tune out. And I think there's something going on now where people are starting to value their attention. I mean, this panel is not the only example. There is this sense that, we've let things go too far. There is something of a reaction to advertising-based models. I tend to think a lot of our speech environment it depends on business models and depends on industrial structure. There's been, whether it's small things like ad blocking, whether it's, moving towards paid media models, whether it's almost everyone in the media feeling somehow they need to get something other than advertising to have it work. I think there is just sort of a craving from having enjoyed the novelty of the web and having everything you possibly can. I think there's a natural movement going back towards more trusted sources of information, a little calmer, because you get sick of the cotton candy after a while. I also think that the president's current strategy of dominating headlines and so forth, eventually, The Apprentice started to lose ratings after about 2 seasons, so I predict a similar pattern, frankly, for this president. I think his method is based on attentional domination, but ratings are fickle. And, everyone gets sick of a shtick. I mean, we need to talk about it in entertainment terms, because that's the way it is.
We're going to binge watch Trump and then be done.
No, people will be done. I think there's a natural reaction. I think there's a movement going on. I think these issues are getting more attention. There's a craving for something different. And so that gives me some sense of hope.
While Zeynep, you're answering, let's just see some hands, and then the mic can find you so that we're ready with the question. Please.
Right. So I'm actually an optimist. I know I sound so cheery, but the thing is, as we discussed, these methods of censorship or disrupting freedom of assembly or capturing attention are not based on overt repression most of the time. It's the kind of thing you can organize against. You have to organize a street protest, for example, but knowing this is what you're doing. I think you have to sort of sometimes play the attention game yourself. You have to figure out what's going on, and you have to play on the same thing. With the president, I think his attention domination really helped him get elected. Of course, once he's the president, as you say, it's really tricky because you're not going to ignore a potential war because he could actually start one. So this is not, it's not the same thing anymore. So I feel like bringing forth these invisible structures, the business model, the persuasion architecture, the asymmetric surveillance of all of us, the data environment, the manipulation, the algorithmic, the technological things, how they can figure out. The more we make them explicit, the more we can organize against them. I mean, right now, traditional ads don't work. Why? Because we're cynical. We look at it and we're like, oh, ad, you roll your eyes, right? So that's why there's sort of this subtle nudging or native ads or this or that is kind of emerging. As a generation understands the sort of tentacles into you, you learn to organize against this. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do a lot is like, let's make these hidden persuasion architectures, the surveillance, let's make them explicit, and then let's figure out how do we defend ourselves against this, and let's find alternative business models. How do we find speech? How do we protect freedom of assembly environment like that? And I think it's kind of natural that we were kind of taken aback at first because this is a complicated thing, but there's much more understanding, as you say, at the individual level, at the movement level, at the institutional level. We can do this because we also have the tools to connect, and we also have all these sort of, they're great in so many ways. I didn't just want to sound pessimistic. I mean, so.
So let's see, please, if you don't mind telling us who you are and being brief. Thank you.
My name is Peter Stern, and I'm with the Freedom of the Press Foundation. Now, Zeynep, one thing that you said that really sort of scared me the most, I think, was when you talked about how the people who are crafting these technologies and these business models are not necessarily the people who are going to control their future implementation. So I think that what Tim has discussed, this concern that, oh, we're losing our inner consciousness and free will is certainly concerning. You know, you can drown out important speech, but as he said, no one is starving. And I guess my question is, do you think it's possible that the government will or could trend in a more authoritarian direction and sort of commandeer these architectures to promote a more traditional sort of oppressive?
China is a very good example. People think of China as old-style censorship. I watched them react to the Hong Kong movement by ignoring it, by pulling back the police so there was no spectacle. Visual spectacle of police brutality is a traditional way movements get sparked and coalesce. They pulled them back when the protesters were in the commercial area, so some local like mafia-like groups wanted them out. Government pulled them back. They did everything right to smother it by denying it attention in very, very, like if I were the evil advisor, I'd be like, this is how you smother a social movement. So you see in China this manipulation of attention and control of, because the country has 500 million people online. Okay, they're not censoring everything. They are controlling and manipulating things because you can't censor everything. I mean, it's obviously complicated in the sense that you need to have some level of legitimacy with the people. It can't be just this total dystopian 1984 scenario because that will just not work. So I absolutely think that we're going to have the Leni Riefenstahls, to be honest. We're going to have our own birth of nation kind of things where the craft of doing something really well in the early 20th century, it was movie making when people weren't really sure how to deal with it, is going to be absorbed into structures of power directly. And it's not just going to be China, because if you're a government, you're thinking about this, and it can start with well-meaning stuff. let's nudge people nicely. And I'm not totally against that, right? Let's make sure they save for retirement, that kind of things. But the downside and dark side, especially with an information asymmetry where you don't know what's going on, and it's there, the problem here is the lack of accountability, lack of transparency, lack of responsiveness. And the danger is it is so effective because it's silent and subtle and private that it's very tempting for the people in power. And that's why we should sort of raise the alarm before it gets anywhere else, because it will. History says it will, and I don't care what Mark Zuckerberg says is his intention, right? That's not how history says it works.
Dave?
Hi, thanks. Dave Schultz. I'm with the Media Freedom and Information Access Clinic at Yale Law School. I just want to go back to another question that was touched on a little bit. You haven't talked much about algorithms. I'm concerned about how technology is shaping what we know. And I think you talked about the breakdown of a public sphere, a commons where we can have meaningful communications. And I think both of you cited the business model as one of the main problems today, but there wasn't much said about that. And I think back of what we think about the golden age, you know, when we had discourse and democratic functioning. We had a personal attack rule, we had the Fairness Doctrine, we had lots of things that controlled what people could say. And today, what we basically have is regulation by profit. You know, the only thing that determines what people put on the air or where they go is clicks and making money. There's really, now, I don't mean to have an argument about whether that's good or bad, but the question is there any way to affect that business model to push it in a direction towards making sure that people get the types of information and it gets through that is useful or necessary in democracy through tax policy, through various types of regulation that would bring us to a better spot.
So Tim, before you answer, just if people want to raise their hands so we can move the mic while you're answering, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it is a great question. I think that I think we did allude to it somewhat. Sometimes people talk about filter bubbles, or we are, as you said already, in a world where we mainly consume information which has been tailored to appeal to our existing prejudices, and essentially trigger emotions like angry agreement or fury or
Cuddly.
What is it? I read one of these studies once where they figured out the 7 emotions that were the best, not only for making you aroused, but then also willing to share, because that's critical.
Yeah.
Like, I have to, it's not only like, am I going to look at this, but also am I going to push this on to someone else, because otherwise it doesn't achieve virality. And, that's obviously, there's some evident dangers for those goals and the goals of sort of some, Habermasian public discourse in an ideal model. I'm not going to say, though, that, you can probably at panels throughout the last 2,000 years, people have been saying, our public discourse is so broken. And I want to say there are some good, it is easy to have a conversation right now. It's just that it's whether it is real conversation is the question. Is there any regulation, do we need to bring the Fairness Doctrine back? What makes this happen? I think I'm going to punt a little and say these are issues for the Knight Institute, because those are hard questions. The Fairness Doctrine has often been seen by many as being in some tension with the First Amendment and regulation of advertising, depending on how you see it. It's seen at least by some by being in tension with the First Amendment, and so figuring out, I think, how these kind of First Amendment ideas work in an era where censorship, I guess that's what we're trying to tee up these challenges, an era where censorship is not achieved in the old ways, but is achieved by, as you said, drowning out, decrediting, distracting, and so forth. Does that call for an entirely different view of what law's role is, other than the simple, protect the marketplace and competition of ideas?
Well, I mean, if I can add one thing, I can't get into why, but there's a very strong structural reasons why these things become centralized, right? Why Facebook and Google have 90% of ad revenue, why I have to be on Facebook. I literally cannot, there's so many people I cannot reach and things I cannot do without it. Long story why, but the centralization is a major threat to free speech. So figuring out ways so that there's at least some market competition, so that we can make more informed choices.
That sounds like what I should be saying. Market, antitrust.
Right. Well, the thing is,
yeah.
I think the thing, even without antitrust regulation,
Right.
and I understand it's like you're the law person,
No, it's fine.
but the thing is, data portability, transparency in surveillance. Data portability would help break network effects. I'm not going to go into it at length. So there are things that I think we could introduce that would empower the users so that we don't have this centralization tendency. Amazon, eBay, Facebook, Google, there's a reason they're so centralized. That would help not just by law, but by people having essential choice. At the moment, if you're a social movement, if you're not on Facebook, you may as well give up. And long story why that is, but that just don't use it is not an option because that is the public sphere. So maybe can we go back to some mechanisms where we have a more diverse public sphere so people can make more informed choices, I think would be one way to go that would fall short of antitrust, but would be an upper thing than let's let them centralize with no protection for the individual.
If we can be very brief, let's take one more question and brief responses. And I think the mic has landed somewhere.
Hi, thank you so much for your thoughts today. I'm a freshman at Columbia University. And so to Professor Tufekci's point, you brought up that, social media actually, that in social movements, in social media, there's a way to exclude people from discourse because people control and push them out of the public sphere. I wanted to ask about the other side of that, where I feel that social media movements actually can exclude people who disagree with them because with something as simple as like a hashtag, it doesn't really provide a way to express. It's something to hold on to rather than, it's just a very small idea that many people want to latch onto without really providing like a basis or maybe just conversation for it. So I wanted to ask whether like this accessibility to expression actually shuts down discourse by excluding both sides.
So very brief final responses from both of you.
I think it's interesting. If you go back and read Time magazine, which was designed for short attention spans in the 1960s, articles seem really challenging by today's. And I don't know how we got to the point where Twitter and cable news are our dominant ways of conversing. They're both, I don't know which is worse sometimes. I mean, they're sort of, they are not hallmarks of a deep civilization. How's that? So much of our discourse is limited to 140 characters or one or two sentences and a nice smile. And that, I guess, reflects on the
So I'll end on an optimist. I really am. I am sorry to be such a downer, but I am an optimist. I think that we know the design principles to try to develop for a better conversation. Can't go into it again, but you don't have to do it the way things are.
I agree.
You could design for, and let me run Twitter and I will design it for you.
I think it's a great idea.
Yes, I will tell Jack. So the thing is, I think what we've gotten here, there's a lot of contingency. The way newspapers were financed by advertising is kind of a contingency. Some of how we got here, there are a lot of contingencies. And that's why I want the centralization to be broken up for experimentation in ways of conversing online where the architecture, instead of fueling outrage around the hashtag where you can coalesce but can't have deeper conversations, we could do just the opposite by building it to encourage the other way. And it could work. And I want those experiments to happen. I feel like we're so constricted. We got this amazing technological design space, And because of network effects and the way the technology centralizes, we're right here. Like, why are we right here? Let's expand. And for the Ninth Amendment, that's a great challenge. Like, what is this design space? What is the experimentation space? What are the architectures that allow for people to be heard in ways that make sense? And of course, let's not idealize the past, right? I mean, I hear people, it's not like we had ever a perfect past, but we're going towards a very narrow road. We don't have to do this.
Right. Let me say one last thing on behalf of technologists. I mean, I'm a person who's been following the tech industry very carefully, and I think the era of this problem will take care of itself has got to be over.
Yeah.
You know, that is the main, tech has had this like, or we can like
move
come
fast
up with
and break
just the right
things.
thing.
No.
That has been the curse of tech, and I will commit some guilt in this, and I think a lot of us in tech, we're just like, you know, just have an open protocol and everything will take care of itself. And I think that has failed. And
I'm
it's
a former programmer.
Right,
this
so
is how
am I.
we do,
yeah,
right?
and we have somewhat failed. So let's speak as tech people. We have somewhat failed the world, and we need to, but we can do better. I mean, one optimistic idea is we have to design things better. Exactly as you said. To be better, assuming it'll just take care of itself.
So with that, let me say I think you've started to pay your penance today by enriching our collective discourse, and I want to suggest to everybody here that one of the great solutions is turn off your Trump feed, stop watching anything that Trump says, and instead devote some attention to reading Twitter and Tear Gas, The Power and Fragility of Network Protest, and The Attention Merchants, both of which will continue to enrich our discourse and this conversation for the rest of the day. I want to thank you for kicking us off to such a robust intellectual start. You've given us a lot to think about. You've given Jamil, I think, a lot to do in the months that come ahead, and I hope this is just the beginning of a very complex conversation. So thank you.
Thank you.